Welcome to the CIDCI Online Salon Series. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the CIDCI Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you here today. The Center for Innovation in the Design and Construction Industry is a not-for-profit organization that relies on your financial support to provide these programs. Thank you to our sponsors who make all of this possible. Please consider participating in CIDCI as a listener to these free webinars or as a sponsor. If your company needs to stay abreast of the latest innovation, and if you want to inspire your colleagues, we are your go-to destination. CIDCI is pleased to announce the Research to Practice initiative, which invites students from around the world to submit a solution to a wicked problem within the AEC industry. Submission requirements can be found on the CIDCI website. We will be awarding at least $5,000 in prize money to individuals or teams. As we begin our time together today, we would like to extend our solidarity with our Ukrainian partners and the people of the Ukraine. The Russian invasion is not only a war on Ukraine, but a threat to democracy, human rights, and world peace. International collaboration is at the heart of CIDCI, and we are proud of our international partners across the globe. We stand with the people of the Ukraine. Today, we are so delighted to feature a conversation between Vince Martinez and Kira Gould from Architecture 2030. They will explore how might we achieve meaningful carbon emissions impact in the AEC sector. What are the opportunities for carbon reduction in the built environment, including building green infrastructure, building reuse, and innovative materials such as mass timber? Here's a bit of information about our speakers. For the past 16 years, Vince Martinez has been leading Architecture 2030. This groundbreaking effort catalyzed global building decarbonization efforts through the development and activation of networks focused on private sector commitments, education, and public policies. Today, Vince will be in conversation with one of my favorite people, Kira Gould. Kira is a writer, strategist, and convener. She co-authored the book Women in Green with Lance Hosey, who led a CIDCI webinar last year. She currently hosts the Design the Future podcast with Lindsay Baker. Welcome, Kira. Welcome, Vince.
Thank you, Margie. Nice to be here.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having us.
Okay, I'm going to start off with a brief presentation, and then we're going to have a bit of a dialogue with Kira, and then we'll take questions. So we're going to be talking about 2030's work more broadly in catalyzing the global built environment on decarbonization, but a bit of the progress that we're making so far, but what we still have yet to achieve. We'd like to start every presentation with explaining what we have in terms of the carbon budget. Many of you may be familiar with the work of the International Panel on Climate Change and their assessments of the amount of emissions that we put up into the atmosphere every year, and then how much we have left to contribute to the emissions of the atmosphere if we're going to maintain temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or less. So that's the number that you typically have heard from the Paris Agreement, is the keeping global warming temperature under 2 degrees, but shooting for 1.5. So that 1.5 is really one of the main thresholds of the climate science. If we get beyond that, we start seeing more positive feedback loops. I think they should be called negative feedback loops, but things start to get a little more out of hand and unreachable in terms of stabilizing the climate. And the last IPCC report came out last year. They talk about what was left of the carbon budget for 1.5, and that they really talk about it in probability. So obviously you can put more, you can put less, and then there's different chances that the atmosphere would then get out of hand. And so what they say is that for a 76% probability, a 2/3 chance of staying below 1.5, we have about 340 to 400 gigatons left of emissions that we can put into the air, of CO2 emissions. And this could be included in CO2e as well, different greenhouse gas emissions. But the way we look at it is we contribute now globally about 40 gigatons of emissions annually into the atmosphere. So when we think about, okay, we have 340 to 400 gigatons left, and you hear a lot of the commitments and the targets from nations or beyond industry of looking at zeroing out emissions by the year 2050, just a linear progression from where we are now to 2050 still emits over 600 gigatons of carbon emissions, way overshooting the 340 to 400 gigatons to have a high probability of staying below 1.5. So they're just not aligned. 1.5 is not really aligned with zero emissions by 2050, no matter how you slice it. So you have to really look at, if you want to keep within 1.5 and keep the high probability, we actually need to reduce emissions faster than that. Some back of the envelope calculations would show a 50 to 65% reduction from our current annual output in the next 10 years, and then phasing out fossil fuel emissions by 2040 puts us on a pretty good track to burn in only that 340 to 400 gigatons. So we have a better probability, about 50 to 65% probability of making sure that we stay below 1.5. So those are the numbers that are really critical here, is immediately capping emissions globally, a 50 to 65% reduction in the next decade, and then phasing out all fossil fuel emissions in 2040 if we're going to have the best chance. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how we actually think that's very achievable. Now, we started Art Architecture 2030 by really changing the conversation, reframing the pie chart. Some of you may know of our founder and CEO, Edward Mazzaria, who had a very pivotal issue in Metropolis magazine in 2003 called Architects Pollute, and he was really trying to reshape the pie chart for what the built environment was responsible for in terms of energy consumption and emissions. In the past, residential and commercial construction or buildings were separated. There was no construction industry. It was all part of the broader industry, and Ed really brought all of those things together in a US context and then later with global statistics. We're fortunate enough now that a UN FCCC agency, the Global Alliance for Building Construction, which we are a founding member of and formed at the COP21 in Paris, now does that global tracking with the International Energy Agency. And what they're telling us in the latest report is that the built environment, not just buildings, but the built environment is almost 50% of global emissions, which is roughly what we had seen in the US about 2 decades ago. About 27% of global emissions is building operations. That's heating, lighting, cooling, hot water, all of your plug loads, everything we use to keep the buildings running. About 10%, and this is usually what the statistics, if you see other webinars or other series on embodied carbon, which we'll talk about later, is the building, construction, and the materials. And they liken that to about 10% of global emissions. And what they're talking about here, though, is really structure and substructure of buildings. And then the construction itself, so the cranes and the generators and all of the building material equipment. Now, they recently launched another category here, this other 10% called other construction industry. And we believe that is the broader development of buildings and the built environment. So that's infrastructure, all the other concrete and steel that we're laying for roadways, highways, parks, seawalls, et cetera. So when you look at the built environment as a whole, of which we know is interdisciplinary and it revolves around a variety of stakeholders, together the built environment is responsible for almost 50% of emissions. And that's an annual output, and that will change over time. Now let's see the progress that we've made so far when we first started talking about some of these issues. But first we have to see what the trend was before that. So since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, essentially growth in the building sector has been equated with energy consumption growth and emissions growth in the building sector. So this is back to 1995 to 2005, and you'll see that as we add more building floor area, we add more energy consumption and we add more emissions. This was a direct correlation, and we'd seen that across the board. Now, when we started to change the conversation and engage the industry around the issue of operational emission reductions, we actually saw something really incredible. We saw in the US building stock, we added a considerable amount of floor area, over 50 billion square feet to the US building stock. And at the same time period, we've flatlined energy use. We haven't added any more energy than we used in 2005 to the US building operations. And we've actually reduced emissions by 30%. We're going to unpack this a little bit, but this is really unprecedented. We've decoupled the growth of the built environment from energy consumption and CO2 emissions. That's something we can be very proud of as an industry, but it's something we have more to do. Now let's unpack it a little bit. Now this is actually why we see these changes happening. Now, if you look at the fuel sources in the US, you'll see electricity, on-site gas consumption, and then fuel oil and other types of fossil fuels that are used on site. And you'll see here that the gas consumption and oil consumption has remained flat. That's that energy efficiency piece. So though we've added 50 billion square feet, many of those buildings still used on-site fossil fuels, is the energy efficiency of those buildings, both new buildings and existing buildings, have allowed us not to increase the use of those fossil fuels on site. The electricity use, again, the energy consumption has remained level, but the emissions have actually dropped down by 30% due to switches in the grid. Some of that, yes, came from moving from coal, which is very carbon intensive, to gas for electricity use, but a lot of it, almost half of it, came from renewable energy. And if you look now, the trend is for that to continue significantly. We see that wind and solar are by far the cheapest source of new electricity consumption. Generation. They were pretty much the only things that have been moving forward during the pandemic, and we've seen this trend moving forward. They're growing exponentially. So what's next is then the reduction of that on-site fossil fuel use over time, over the next 20 years, and we can see that zero emissions from operations in the US building stock is achievable. Now, we're starting to see some similar trends on the global level. These are global statistics looking back since 2010, and you'll see that energy use over the last 4 years or so has started to level out. And you see here that CO2 emissions are also starting to drop. And that, again, that has to do with advances in energy efficiency, keeping things level, and then the decarbonization mostly of the grid, reducing emissions. So lots to be hopeful for on building operations, and we'll talk about expanding on that work in just a moment. What we have to be looking forward to in the future, certainly there's job security for everybody on this call. We're expected to double the built environment. Everything we built from the dawn of time till today, we're planning on building again in the next 4 decades. It's almost unbelievably unfathomable. You know, you've heard statistics like Paris, the entire city of Paris a week, the city of New York every 34 days. You know, these are the types of statistics that we're seeing. And where is that global building stock going to go? Certainly there's still, the global north is still planning on building out. China will probably, though, be built out in the next decade. And so after 2030, most of the global development will move to the global south. India and Africa, which to have roughly the same population as China. So you can imagine the amount of infrastructure and development that will happen there. This is something we have to keep our eye on. In addition, when we reach our 2040 date, when we have to phase out fossil fuel emissions, we know that the total building stock, although we're adding quite a bit over the next 2 decades, about 2/3 of the building stock then will be buildings that exist today. So those buildings in many cases are still inefficient, or they use fossil fuels on site. They're not powered by renewable energy. These are things that are opportunities for the design, building, and construction industry to have interventions in to decarbonize them as well. We have millions and millions of buildings that exist right now that need to be decarbonized. We see that the formula is relatively straightforward for building operations. We need to make sure that buildings are efficient. That for new buildings, that's the building energy code. For existing buildings, there's new performance standards that are being developed to make sure that those buildings maintain efficiency levels. We need to make sure that those buildings are not burning fossil fuels on site. The traditional approach of that now is building electrification, but it also could be non-emitting other sources of heat. And then making sure that once those buildings are efficient, they're not burning any fossil fuels on site, that the power that they do receive comes from non-emitting sources. That's the equation. There's a lot of other things you could add to this framework, building optimal to make sure that they interact with the grid, but this is the base level of the framework. And we're starting to see this move forward in a very meaningful way, not just through practice, of which we've seen buildings that can read zero carbon on operations for zero to no cost premium. And then you also are seeing it in public policy, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the dialogue with Kira. Now, when we talked about doubling the building stock, that's just operations to get them under control, is making sure there's zero carbon on operations. But all of the materials that go into that new built environment, all of the infrastructure that will be supporting that built environment, and then the construction itself of those buildings, we start to try to understand the time value of carbon. When we build a building, all of the materials and all the construction practices, that's the main source of emissions. That's what happens in year one. The operations, we don't flip on the switch until later to make sure those buildings operate. So the time value is really important. All that new development over the next 20 years, the majority of their emissions are going to be from the materials and the construction, not from the operations of those buildings. And as we've talked about, the formula is relatively straightforward for operations. So this is really the new area, as well as building resilience, which we'll talk about later. But the embodied carbon of the materials and the construction is really the new focus area, both for practice and for policymaking. And so we think the formula looks something like this, with a lot of things underneath these categories. But essentially, it's let's make sure we best use the carbon we've already put into the atmosphere, meaning the materials that have already been built or are put together, and the buildings that have already been built. How can we best reuse buildings and infrastructure, and how can we best reuse the materials if we did have to take them apart? The second big concept is the reduction. And this is sort of the energy efficiency of the operation side. This is how do we reduce the amount of materials or the intensity of the materials that we do choose to use when we do need to build. So that's material optimization, but it's also looking for opportunities just in the construction practices and the timeline of construction about how we use those materials to reduce their emissions. We can unpack that a little bit more as well. And then the last piece is, can we leverage the built environment to actually sequester carbon emissions? And so the concepts here are around certainly material use. There are opportunities for nature-based materials, biomaterials that can sequester carbon during their growth cycle, and then we use them in the buildings for long-term storage. But there's also really great opportunities in building sites and landscapes about leveraging those better practices to make sure that they can sequester carbon over their lifetime, and they can maintain that as a durable form of carbon sequestration. So these are all of the growing landscape of embodied carbon reduction strategies. And we're seeing these happen both in practice at all different scales, from architecture, structural engineering, landscape architecture, planning, and infrastructure design. But we're also seeing it in terms of policymaking. This is a whole new area of policymaking, and we're having folks work on whole building life cycle assessment, policy reduction targets, in individual building material reduction targets. We can talk about that in the dialogue, but policy is moving in this direction as well. Now, last year, the Conference of Parties from the UN was held in Glasgow. This was 6 years, technically, after Paris in 2015, but this was the meeting, the fifth meeting after that, which is the opportunity for this countries to come back with their nationally determined contributions to meeting the Paris Agreement. And that gave it a lot of importance in Glasgow to talk about what the countries were going to be doing. And we were supportive, and many other building sector organizations, in putting together the best coalition we could of the largest architecture, engineering, construction, design, and planning firms to talk about the work that they were already doing to meet some of these targets, and to reaffirm that the Paris Agreement was still within reach. And so we helped convene a communique with about 70 of the largest and most influential architecture, design, and planning firms, mostly US based, but have offices all over the world, as well as about 24 industry organizations representing over 1 million members and professionals around the world from a variety of different disciplines: mechanical engineering, landscape architecture, architecture, and looking at it from multiple countries' perspectives. So we brought this coalition together, and it was a very powerful moment. COP27 coming up will be in Egypt, and that also provides another opportunity to talk about design, the new design philosophy, and new parameters in the global south as development starts to move there, as I mentioned earlier, after the next decade. So really wonderful to see all of the firms and industry organizations that have really embraced climate action, and they're focusing to provide resources to their members about how to achieve these goals in both operational emission reductions and embodied carbon. So I'm going to close the presentation with just a little talk about what's next, the beyond 2030 aspects. And I think that there are a few new ideas here that are worth investing in. Margie and CIDCI, I think, had a wonderful quote from John Steinbeck on your all's website to talk about that ideas are like rabbits. Once you get one, you can get a bunch. And it's not, the question is, what do you tend to? What rabbits do you tend to? What are the ones that demand their attention? And we think these are them. One is to expand beyond the building. There's so many opportunities in landscape architecture, urban planning, civil engineering, and infrastructure design for both embodied carbon reductions, because those disciplines use as much concrete and steel as the buildings do, which are the heavy emitting materials. But they also have more opportunities to reduce their design and emissions through just design practices, but also through the choice of materials and vegetative materials and landscapes to sequester emissions. We talked a little bit about that before, but biogenic carbon sequestration is really ripe here, much more at a larger scale than anything we might use in a building to date, although there are innovations happening on materials for buildings as well. So this is a new area of focus and is very interdisciplinary. Many of these infrastructure or larger landscape projects, it's landscape architects, it's civil engineers, it's structural engineers, it's urban planners. So this is a whole other realm of folks. And most of the conversations here have been around city resilience or biodiversity, livability, but there hasn't really been a very strong focus on the embodied carbon opportunities in this scale. The other big area, the rabbit that we're tending, is the question about reusing that existing infrastructure that we already have, existing building renovation. And then we get sort of two big wins from this opportunity. Both we decarbonize the existing buildings infrastructure, of which we said was about 2/3 of the future stock. But we also get the great opportunity to reduce embodied carbon emissions because we don't have as much emissions going into a renovation project as we would going into a new construction. That's most of the time when we're trying to quantify that. Folks are trying to embed building reuse as both a climate action strategy, but also a cultural heritage opportunity. And so this is a really ripe sector for us to develop. I should note too, and we'll probably discuss this a little bit more, but we're seeing more and more renovation projects across the sector. So the AIA had a recent, Kermit Baker, their chief economist, has been talking about a trend of seeing growth in renovation projects. About half of all architectural billings last year were renovation and half were new construction. That's grown from about 30% during the recession, but it's a trajectory that's not a blip, it's a trend. And so we're going to see more and more opportunities in building reuse. And then finally, Margie mentioned in the introduction, is about material innovation. We recognize that we will continue to use all sorts of building materials in construction and infrastructure, and there are opportunities to reduce their emissions and use them effectively. There's innovations happening in this front, not just on mass timber, which is something that Margie brought up earlier that we can talk about leveraging a bio-based material that can store carbon. It has a lot of other benefits, which we can discuss in terms of construction practices and timelines, but also innovations in other more traditional materials and high impact materials like concrete and steel are making significant innovations. Some of those are commercially available now. Some of those are state of the shelf. Some of those are design practice applications. And then some of those are under development and R&D and really exciting opportunities for the future of materials. So we have opportunity to focus on that and talk about that. So with that, I will pause, and I think we are gonna have a dialogue first, right, Kira? And then we'll take questions broader from the audience. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we don't have to just have a background image, but excited for the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Vince. That was really an excellent overview and touched on a lot of the really big issues. And I have lots of questions. But I thought, so there's a couple of things that you touched on that I'd like to get into a little bit more. And one of them is the topic of co-benefits. That is a term that we're beginning to hear more and more. And I think it relates to several of the things that you talked about. And I'm particularly interested in it as it relates to the landscape and planning possibilities and where we can do biogenic restoration and resilience planning at the same time as we address carbon, for example. But I'm wondering if you could just unpack co-benefits as a general concept a little bit for this group and maybe talk a little bit about how you see that impacting the AEC world in the coming years.
Sure. One of my favorite little comic strips that I've seen in the past, and I pull it up and read it directly, but it's a presentation of a panel and say, wait, if climate change is a hoax, we still get all these benefits. And it's like livable communities and clean air and clean water and all these other things. Like nobody in any industry is doing any of this work just solely for the climate. they have to make sense for a variety of other benefit opportunities, including a financial benefit, but definitely a health, a life safety. Um, they're just overall have provided enough impact that they're worth doing. And so we can unpack that on any of these topics, but let's just take something that's now becoming a policy implementation piece, that's building electrification. We're not choosing to move to heat pump technology or induction technology on cooking because they're worse technologies. They actually are more efficient, they're safer, they have additional benefits for cleanliness and use. If for heat pumps, for example, you get heating and you get cooling at the same time. So that's one example about things that are sort of beyond the carbon emissions associated with those products and technologies. There's another great quote, and I wish I knew who said it, but it probably some tech person that said, "We didn't move away from the Iron Age because we ran out of iron." I always talk about whale oil. We didn't stop using whale oil because, in many cases, I guess we did run out of whales to hurt. But the issue is that we move beyond technologies when other opportunities open up. And I think we're at the time where we're starting to see that, and that's also a design parameter. We can move forward when we see additional benefits on biodiversity, on health and livability, biophilia. There's an attraction to those design standards, and we're getting better products and better results and better performance. You've seen all the data that's come out of the green building movement over the last 2 decades about better performance for workers, better learning and understanding for education and kids. So, there's a lot of other of these co-benefits that are driving the market. And in many cases on the infrastructure side, that's actually what's leading it, is that the resiliency benefits of these strategies, the livability, the biodiversity benefits, you're sort of they always talk about that's the backyard to the urban environment, is these opportunities, landscapes. And we're doing that to minimize heat island effect, for mitigation as well as adaptation. So it's really a win-win-win across the board when you see all of these things. And that's the beauty of design and construction, is that we can re-envision how these pieces work together and get a better product out of it.
Yep. I love that characterization of it, because I think it relates to the topic of value and what we value and how that is manifesting in the market too. And I think we're hearing a lot more now about green assets and brown assets and how that's going to be playing out, and how those are, a broad range of things are factoring into what is going to be qualified as a green asset going forward, including resilience factors and all sorts of other, paying attention to longer term risk. And we're just defining value more robustly now than we were even 15 years ago, I think, which is exciting, actually.
And investors are seeing that more and more. They recognize that decarbonization of the global economy will occur. It's not a question of if, it's when. Mm-hmm. And so getting ahead of that and asking their high emitting, in what they're investing in that's high emitting, like concrete or steel, or steel mostly, you see this in conversation because it's more of a global commodity and it's less regional, but they're asking, what are you doing to decarbonize?
Right.
What is the next step? We know that there's eventually going to have some sort of financial implications to emitting. And if we don't get a handle on that now, it's going to hit the pocketbook. So there's definitely the financial one, as well as all of those other.
That's right. That's right. Well, and that relates a little bit to, I do think that conventional economics and pro formas to a certain extent have not done a great job of valuing existing buildings in the past, and that maybe we are seeing that change. You mentioned the Kermit Baker article, and I put the link in the chat, but let's talk a little bit about that. You've noted that it's not a fleeting trend. This is a growing trend and maybe becoming much more relevant. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you anticipate that going forward?
Sure. What we've seen, again, there's 2 opportunities here from a climate perspective. There's the opportunity to reduce the operational emissions of that building, bring that up to date to the next, to bring that asset up to date. And then there's also the opportunity to reduce the amount of emissions for new materials in the development. But those are also very place-based. A lot of these things are, they have a resonance and a meaning to the local community. We're seeing a lot more focus on community priorities. And so there's value in sort of the heritage or the cultural aspect of existing buildings. There's an article coming out in Architect Magazine by another senior fellow of ours, Carl Elefante, who's been a strong advocate for the building reuse and renovation, not just on historic buildings, but overall, of talking about how this is a very meaningful design opportunity. That it's just as rewarding in terms of design and I think is in terms of construction as building a new building. There's so many great opportunities to revitalize that building, and I think this is sort of an interesting opportunity for other disciplines besides architecture as well, like structural engineering, for example, is how do they provide their value and say, this actually might take significant engineering skills to keep this existing building up, and without using a lot of embodied carbon and new materials to keep it up. And it's a design challenge and something that's sort of different in their marketplace, but something that is just as complicated, if not more complex, than a new building that they might put out. So there's opportunities, I think, for new markets and development for other disciplines, not just architecture.
Yeah.
But then you sort of get this idea of sort of scale. I mentioned in some of my initial remarks about the growth patterns that are expected to see, doubling of the building stock globally. Those are the projections for a growing population across the globe, including the global north. The question is, does that have to be the case? We have so much abandoned infrastructure in the global north, both in the US and North America and Europe particularly, that's just really not being utilized or leveraged. And that's not just the buildings, but the infrastructure themselves. I mean, you look at an example like the city of Detroit, which they were shutting down sort of certain neighborhoods due to expanded infrastructure. We have so much left we can still work with and revitalize communities. So I think this is really a community revitalization approach. I'll just go back to one really important case study, I think, about building reuse and renovation, which is the Empire State Building. That was always talked about. RMI, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute, would talk about that as a deep renovation project. And what was really interesting, I think, was sort of the untold story about that project is that, yes, they were doing a renovation. Yes, they were tunneling through the cost barrier by already leveraging that renovation to just do the incremental upgrades on higher, deeper energy efficiency. And at the time, it was more focused on deep energy efficiency reduction. But the real story behind that is it was an asset reclassification. The Empire State Building was starting to become more of a Class B office building when you see all of the new development that was happening in New York City. And so it needed a revitalization if it was going to compete in the marketplace. And the opportunity there was that it's not just a good to have, but it is a must have to have a high performance building when you do those renovations. It's no longer just about the aesthetics and, okay, we redid the entryway and the lobby and we put in a new system, but it's really about what does the building perform? And that's what many of the largest tenants that are moving into those markets want to see, is the performance of those buildings. So the existing building aspects has so many benefits across the board. And I think that's why we're starting to see more and more of the billings going in that direction.
Absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about policy. There are a couple things floating around right now that people might have questions about. One of those is there's a new Building Performance Standards Coalition that the White House launched late last year, early this year.
Late January.
It's all a blur. And maybe you could talk a little bit about building performance standards and how that relates to regional markets, but also to general trends and sort of what the landscape looks like on the sort of regulation side, because that's certainly a part of what's coming.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's already here in many areas. So building performance standards, for those of you that aren't familiar, have emerged out of building benchmarking and disclosure ordinances that have mostly been at the city level, but in some state levels over the last, I'd say 10 years or so. We started to see the first of those in about 2010. And that was the first sets of policy were just about tracking the performance of a building. The city governments wanted them to disclose their energy performance, and mostly it was focused on energy. There was not really a question about what fuels you were using at the time, although that was included. And one of the first cities to sort of move beyond this benchmarking and disclosure piece, but actually set requirements for larger existing buildings in terms of their performance, both either energy or emissions, was New York City. The policy is called Local Law 97, and it's based on an emissions reduction target. So there's an emission standard for large buildings, and there's a threshold of which they have to start ratcheting down their emissions over 5-year periods, with a trajectory to get tighter and tighter. Some of these policies we're seeing are more energy focused. I'm based in Washington State. There's a Clean Buildings Act here in the state that requires energy performance reductions for buildings. You saw some of these policies started as sort of tune-up ordinances, make sure that you do an audit and do some commissioning. But these are now starting to really ratchet up, and there's 32 jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, as part of this coalition in 2 states, and many more that will come, and they're going to be sharing best practices about how they develop these policies. Now, I was involved really heavily with a lot of commercial real estate folks when I was supporting the 2030 Districts Network, which are private-public partnerships in downtown cores, now in 23 markets, and it was very clear that these policies were going to be coming. I mean, just, no matter how much the city said, oh, we just want to measure this information and have it, make sure it's available to those that are interested in leasing or buying the buildings, we knew that eventually they were going to make requirements of these buildings. And so we often think of in the design and construction industry that policy happens to us. That something is going on the sidelines, and all of a sudden now we're required to meet yet another set of standards. But policy making is iterative, and it's a community-based, and there's plenty of opportunities. I saw a great quote from Mayor Garcetti in LA I think it was 2 days ago. They just passed essentially it's a electrification policy for new construction. And the quote was, this is happening, this is going to happen, it's going to occur. Do you want to fight the inevitable, or do you want to co-author the necessary? And I think that's really sort of our opportunity in the built environment industry, is to say we want to be part of the policy making. We want to support the development of that work because we know it's going to happen. And so the question comes down to, how are these policies set up? And building performance standards are mostly, again, building on disclosure ordinances, which are for the larger buildings. There's a smaller number of them. They're responsible for most of the emissions. But there's really questions about, how do we make sure these actually work? And so there's capital improvement cycles, like the asset reclassification one we talked about for Empire State Building, leveraging those opportunities, those intervention points where there already is financing, or work's already going to be done, or where the occupants are out. Those are great opportunities to do those upgrades. And that those upgrades should look at a couple different areas, same formula we saw before: efficiency, electrification, and renewable energy, and allow for all of those things. If you get just a standard in your location that's just energy based, like ours in Washington State, they're proposing a new one, but if it's just energy based, basically what we're doing is we're making sure that the really poor performers aren't the poor performers anymore. They kind of get up to the middle part of the bell curve, making sure that they can perform. The high performers, getting every more little drop out of that lemon that you're squeezing is really challenging from an energy perspective. So it's really, those policies are more about moving the market up to a bare minimum. The emissions piece, and I should note that those don't get us to decarbonization. They get us to good efficiency levels, but they don't actually address the fuel use. So the emission side of things is really important to get to decarbonization. And that's where opportunities for installing heat pumps and swapping out from fossil fuel-based systems apply. You also get energy efficiency benefits there too, by the way. And then leveraging renewable energy, both generation, but also procurement, and just making sure you buy clean power. City of San Francisco has a policy for the largest buildings. They're required to buy green power. It's as simple as that. And the premium is very little, and they expect it to be negligent in the next 10 years. And that's a simple solution. And it decarbonizes about half of the operational consumption of those buildings in a blink of an eye, because the grid is where most of that comes from. So that's a really powerful tool. But at the same time, if these performance standards are just emission-based, you don't want somebody to install an inefficient radiant baseboard electric system and power it with renewables, because that's not efficient. That's not the best technology, the best design solution. And so you're starting to see some of these baseline energy efficiency requirements as well, even on these emission-based reduction standards. But what I think it tells us is that we need to be part of the policymaking process, that these things aren't just done to us in the construction and design industry, but they should be done with us, and that we can help inform how these policies make sense in the life cycle of buildings so that we can decarbonize when it makes really good financial and really uninterrupted continuity of the building sense.
Yep, absolutely. And I love that quote. Do you want to fight the inevitable or co-author the necessary? That's great. I think that people may be curious about your perspective on the federal infrastructure bill and how much of that is moving towards carbon neutrality.
Great question. Lots of money there coming out of the feds, and more information each day about how the allocations will happen. I asked some colleagues from the American Institute of Architects to share some of the numbers with me so I could have them available for this webinar. But it's really sort of difficult to parse out how much of this is decarbonization focused. So much about the infrastructure bill was a little bit like I was talking about energy efficiency and building performance standards, about making sure we just bring up our infrastructure to a sort of meaningful level. It's less about sort of leading at the tip of the spear, though that's available within there. But there's a couple areas of focus. They're going to put quite a bit of money into weatherization programs, which is more smaller scale than probably most folks on this call, but there's about $3.5 billion that will go in weatherization assistance. And we really hope that that's more focused on energy efficiency of buildings, so we actually stem the problem instead of just sort of these waivers that basically just give the money to the utility to pay for the delta for low income folks. So this is a really important piece if it's focused on that energy efficiency. And again, a lot of that work will be weatherization pieces, but there's opportunities there for decarbonization through switching off of fossil fuel based heating systems and moving into heat pumps, for example, and getting benefits of cooling as well. There's a big thing we talked about the beyond the building approach. There's about $1 billion in there for building resilient infrastructure in communities, the BRIC program, of which we should see a variety of different fronts. Green infrastructure is noted in that package. So, of that billion, some could go to green infrastructure and decarbonization approaches there. But definitely that's a big deal that's going through FEMA, and with all of the types of disasters that we're seeing across this country, that's a real big deal about making sure that we have resilient infrastructure and that we can build appropriately. There's another one that's about cost-effective code implementation. This is through the Department of Energy's Building Technology Office. It's $225 million in competitive grants. Again, this is also about making sure that states that some of them don't have energy codes at all, or so there's still a few in the country. So about making sure that they adopt building energy codes and tie that to dollars support. But it's also about making sure that those that already do have energy codes make sure that they're adopted and implemented and have the resources to withstand those. So that some of that money will go there, but there is a portion of that they've outlined that says we want to see innovations for reach codes and stretch codes and zero carbon codes. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. The latest IECC codes 2021 is very efficient. And it also has an appendix for zero energy buildings for multifamily and commercial buildings. So that's adding renewable energy to the mix. So we might see more states adopt that and leverage some of the dollars to help with code implementation. And then there's a lot of money. There's 40 million. It's not as much as the other ones, but 40 million in grants to do energy audits and surveys of commercial and residential buildings. I think we'll learn a little bit more about the technology solutions. You'll have commissioning and things in there. So there is some money there as well. And there will be a significant amount of sort of workforce training. So obviously some of these things are new technologies. They require contractors to understand new systems. And so there will be federal dollars coming from the infrastructure package to do that. I really congratulate the AIA and others, agencies, there are other institutions that were advocating that buildings are also infrastructure. They're vertical infrastructure and there's horizontal infrastructure. So I think that was really heard from the administration, and we're seeing the Infrastructure Act has a lot of provisions and dollars for building renovation.
That's great. That's great. I have more questions, but I wonder, Margie, if we should switch over and see if there are questions from the audience that we might want to address. And I'm going to put some more resources in the chat too.
Questions in the chat box, but I'd like to invite our audience to put them there. I do have a question, which is, as you see the countries in Europe moving away from accepting or using natural gas in Russia, do you imagine that that's going to cause more technology and creativity to come from European research institutes and European researchers to create more efficient movement off of natural gas?
Great question, Marty. It's interesting because there's another sort of famous quote from a colleague of mine here in Seattle that I like to use, which what exists must be possible. I actually don't think it's much about new innovations of technologies that's necessary. I think they have the technologies, at least from a building perspective, to get off of foreign gas. And that's really the heat pump technologies and then the renewable electricity technologies to power those heat pumps. And then the storage aspect if the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. But the heat pumps really, there's been a huge market upgrowth, and you'd be surprised because they're coming from the very, very cold climates in Europe. And so it's more a question about, I think the technology exists for cold climates. You get the heating and the cooling, you get the efficiency. It's about getting it out in scale. So I think the innovations are really coming down to sort of market-based programs, of incentive dollars, about how do we just get it out to all of the buildings as fast as possible and renovate them. It's like a bunch of little worker ants having to go from one building to the next. And there's been really innovative programs. The Dutch have had one for a while called Energy Sprong, which is both a facade and a system-based approach. So they actually come in and they sort of on these row houses and they bring up and they slap on these panels and then they throw the solar on. But they also do the systems as well. And those are great, but what I think is the most attractive about those kind of approaches, it's not just the technology solution, but it's a financial solution. Mm-hmm. All of those Dutch residents don't have to pay for that upgrade. It gets deducted out of the savings of their energy bills over time, or it's on their property taxes. There's different financing mechanisms that allow them to not pay any upfront. That's sort of the scalability pieces that are going to be really required. So I think it's less of a sort of technology and it's more of a distribution and implementation and programmatic innovations that we'll start to see across Europe. They've got really great work already on this front. And there's a whole Renovate Europe program that they're very clear that they understand they need to renovate their building stock for a while now. This will just catalyze all of those efforts and lead with existing technologies. I haven't heard yet that they don't have what they need on that front for buildings. I think broader sets of infrastructure and transportation and those other things, because it's not just gas, it's oil too. So that might be where more innovations, but we also have electric cars, and Europe has been leading on that front for a lot longer than we have in the US. So, I think the technologies exist. It's just a matter of getting them out as quickly as possible and then continuing to iterate and invent on top of them.
Great. We have a question here. Your comments about incentives and benefits beyond just reduced carbon really resonated with me. Would you agree that compared to designers and investors, the contractors are generally behind the curve in implementing innovative solutions? How do we get more contractors on board and communicate the urgency as well as opportunities?
Sure. I think that there are some really great con builders out there that are doing some really important work, and they're trying to understand their portion of the industry. Everybody was sort of, okay, this is my piece, this is my piece, and this is my piece. And you saw a lot of really innovative work coming out of like Turner and Skanska and these the big builders about understanding their piece, which they thought was construction, right? And it's like, okay, we bring all these people to the job site and we use a bunch of power and we do these cranes and bulldozers and things. And that's what they were measuring. I think they're recognizing their opportunities to support the broader set, including procurement and supply chain decision-making, which some of it comes from the design professions, but a lot of it is sort of relying on the contractors. So I wouldn't generalize and say that they're all behind. I think it's like any other industry. There's people that are leading, there's people in the middle, and there are laggards. But I think it's sort of inviting them to be more of the conversation up front. And I think this is the same thing with the evolving landscape, is that the embodied carbon conversations have really opened up new players that were left out of sustainability for a long time. So I actually was trained as a structural engineer. And, when I was going through school, there was very little talking about sustainability and structural engineering. It just was all about mechanical and, energy efficiency and things like that. I heard a great Sarah Neff from Lend-Lease, she's now with Lend-Lease, was on a concrete webinar for the National Ready Mix Concrete Association. She said in all of her design charrettes now, the first people in the room are the structural engineer and the contractor. not the architect and the mechanical engineer anymore. So I think it's about changing the conversation, and as more and more of design professionals recognize that, encourage their owners and developers to bring those folks into the room earlier, you're going to see more and more of that industry stepping up to the plate to take on that responsibility. They're so integral in so many different areas, especially around procurement, but it's also a very fragmented, smaller subs and all. It's very hard to sort of track. It's not like one big team, there's so many different aspects of it that it can be difficult to sort of get everybody all on the same page. And that's why getting people in early makes a lot of sense, just like in any integrated design process. So more to do on all sectors, but I think there is some really good work happening there. I'll just mention on that area, what's really exciting too, is that the electrification of construction equipment. And so you actually see, and again, leading in Europe, Volvo has big rigs that are all electric. And they're used at the infrastructure and the mining level, but they're also being used at the project site. I think the city of Oslo has a policy on clean construction sites. They're not allowing any more fossil fuel emitting energy sources when people are building buildings. It's all electric, and then making sure they're tied in the renewable grid. So I think there's innovations there that are starting to now come to other markets on the construction side as well.
I think it's so interesting because Europe seems to be in sort of a group think that we actually have a global problem here, where I'm not sure 75% of Americans actually understand that and believe that. So I wonder if you could talk, and maybe this is a question also for Kira, about sort of the communication strategies in a divided nation like we have here. Where have you seen the conversations actually be able to shift by changing the conversation?
Kira, do you want to go first?
Sure, I will take a stab at that. I actually think that relates a little bit to the value topic that I brought up before, and I think it's simpler than it seems in some ways, because if you focus solely on the things that matter to any given client in any given region, and then propose the best solutions that meet those, you are inherently doing climate smart activities. I mean, that is incredibly reductive and definitely an oversimplification, but I also think that it is at its heart true, because we are to that point. This is why I asked about co-benefits, because I think that is a way of thinking, and people have been saying that we should think that way for many years, and that's an old systems thinking idea, but it is so true. And we are finally, and maybe a little bit of the pandemic helped us understand this better, because we started understanding certain kinds of health benefits as they connect to other things. That was a little bit more of a direct manifestation than we'd had in the past. But I think that ability to reframe the value in the way that makes sense for that client in that place, and what that sometimes means that you do not use the word climate or sustainability, depending where you are. If you're in the Southeast, you might use the word resilience a lot and never use those other words. But you're still talking about human health, ecological health, and survival and thriving of a place and a building, which is an asset to an owner and a community, right? So if you're talking of in those terms, you're putting it in the, framing it in ways that make sense to them and matter to them inherently. You don't even have to have a discussion about the specifics of, when the climate, sea level rise, or any of that stuff, because what we know, we already know what's coming. We know about storms, and we know about the needs for passive survivability and other things like that are human health driven. So to me, it's all about framing it which we've always done anyway, right? Like every business does that anyway. You frame things in the way that matter to your client and to the community. It's that simple. I think that's the main thing that I would say. And it is also true that the markets and all the financial markets, including insurance, are waking up to this in a pretty clear way now, even more than just 5 or 10 years ago. And that's going to continue. So that will only get easier, because the things that you can point to, it will be harder and harder to get insurance for things that are not climate intelligent. You will not be able to build in the way that we did 20 years ago in certain places for very long, in my opinion. Maybe I'm a little optimistic on how quickly the insurance community is catching up, but you do hear it. There's a lot of rumbling in that area. I think it's becoming, I mean, that's why the green assets thing to me is such a big, you hear so much more about that now than you did 5 years ago. Vince, you probably could put a much finer
I
point
would
on
just
that.
add that like so much of that, the value, of course, is always money. And so many of these things, I agree that there's this sort of livability pieces and resilience. The resilience particularly is a very important value now. But the dollar things are just working for the technologies now. I mean, you look at the benefits of any of these approaches, and they're usually you're saving money one way or another, either upfront or operational wise. Most of the time, they wouldn't fly if you did it. Again, they're not just doing this for altruistic reasons. I mean, you just look at some of those technologies. So we talked about heat pump technologies for heating, and yes, they might be more expensive upfront costs than a more traditional fossil fuel system, but you also get the cooling, which is only more important now in a warming world. And also with fire, fire seasons and air quality issues, you want to be able to seal the building and still stay cool in the summers. So, you get added benefit. And so if you took the cost of doing an air conditioning system and the heating system together in a residential area, then like it's far cheaper to do the heat pump piece. You also get the efficiency of them being 3 times more efficient, 300% efficiency than the efficient gas system. And then you get people saying, well, yeah, but what about the cost of electricity and these other things, which is also going down when you add an on-site solar issues. So I think that we're sort of winning folks over with the technology side of things from a performance aspect too, Margie. So it's like you take, Tesla, which is a really interesting example of innovation, is they were trying to drive performance, right? It's all about performance, about understanding that you can't say, okay, well, that electric vehicle is just not strong enough. It can't do what this more ICE engine can do. Internal combustion engine. Sorry, that's the ICE acronym. But you can now, right? And you can do these big rigs, these giant bulldozers and dump trucks with electric power. And so you kind of get over that sort of fear piece of it, and then it's only benefit. The cost implications are so much cheaper in many areas of the country and the world that it's like, well, doesn't this make sense to have free energy from the sun and the wind distributed? I don't have to rely on some foreign power that holds those things. This is very coming clear in energy security conversations right now. Yeah. Don't have to dig it up, refine it, ship it across the world, then get it to my site. And then if that pipeline goes or that conduit goes, then I'm left hanging. I got free power coming to me with renewables. I've got these technologies, they're cheaper to operate. They give me additional benefit. I just think that sort of the technology revolution, we're here. We're finally here. This isn't the heat pumps of the 1970s. This isn't the solar panels of their initial telescopes and they went up into space, and we're at a whole other revolution, and these technologies only continue to get cheaper and more effective because more investment goes back into them, and we're finding newer and newer solutions, including battery technology. So I just think from a cost perspective, a performance perspective, we're there too, and that makes a lot of sense. You don't have to use the word climate at all. I could say, hey, I only spent $20 charging my electric vehicle for the whole month. And instead of having a combustion engine, I would have spent more like $150 or $200 on gas. So, that's one very economic focus. I didn't say anything about the climate there.
Yeah, totally true.
So I'm so sorry to say this, but our time is coming to a close. I can't thank you both so much for your optimistic and positive view of this really complicated issue. It can often make me just want to roll up into a ball and hide in the closet. And you've actually given us everyone on the call, great hope and also a vision and a path forward. So Vince, I can't thank you enough for all the work that you're doing, and Kira for just being a really fabulous person, asking all the hard questions that Vince may have accidentally avoided in his presentation.
It's a skill.
Yeah, so thank you very, very much. I hope you'll both come back again. And again, thank you so much for all of your work on this issue. So this concludes. Yeah, great. This concludes the CIDCI presentation. Please join us on June 23rd for a conversation with Kurt Ameringer from Dassault Systems. His presentation is entitled, "You Can't Whistle a Symphony." He'll share how process change and best practice experiences from nearly a dozen other industries are transforming our profession in the AEC industry while achieving an increase in performance and safety and lessening the impact on the planet. The session will be recorded and placed on the CIDCI website in YouTube as soon as possible. To join us for future webinars, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website, cidci.org. Special thanks to Katie Olson for keeping us on track and for all of our sponsors who make all of this possible. We'll see you all soon. Thank you again.